Today we will be talking about the potential impact of coronavirus or COVID-19 on clinical trials, and more importantly, sharing our experience in building resilience and agility in this difficult time. The focus is understandably on the frontline healthcare system, as it should be, but I think we all agree that this pandemic has had, or certainly had, an impact on the pharma and biotech industries. Today we're joined by an expert panel representing various GxP. So we have representation from GCP, GVP, GMP, IT, GLP, and Veterinary GCP, and myself moderating. Please can I remind the panel to introduce yourselves before you begin with your GxP. A few points to mention about the webinar. As you can imagine, it is a difficult time, and I think all of us have been quite caught up and busy with managing COVID in our own individual organizations. So what we felt as an organization, as RQA, that it is important that we get together, put some slides together covering the hot topics that we felt might be of interest. So that's what we've done with the slides that we will run through. But more importantly, and we strongly suggest and encourage you to raise questions, to make this as interactive. This is really a session for you. We're here to learn. By no means we're experts on COVID. So we know as much as we know in our organizations, but absolutely, please share experiences, lessons learned with all of us, as I'm sure all of us are here to learn as well. I will say, as with the whole situation, nobody knows what is going to happen with coronavirus. And I do want to make it clear that any views expressed today at the webinar are purely our own, based on, or the panels based on general experience and expertise. They do not represent the views or policies of the organizations that we belong to. And this is really kind of a discussion and an interactive webinar. As I said, collectively, we are going to cover different topics. I'll hand over to you, Carl, if you want to walk us through a few things on the logistics of the webinar.
Yeah, thanks, Samira. So again, welcome everyone. Just a few things that we need to cover for your own knowledge as we go through. So first of all attendees on the call are muted. That's whether you're on Zoom or whether that you're on our YouTube stream. Our YouTube stream is around 20 seconds behind. So you can still use the chat over on YouTube to ask questions, and we'll deal with them at the end. If you are on Zoom, you'll see that on the bottom of your browser, there's a Q&A function. We'd like you to use that to ask any questions if possible. So as we go through the presentation, if you've got any questions at all, then by all means use the Q&A function to ask those questions. There's also a chat function which you can use to send messages to all panelists and attendees if you want to have some discussion during the event. But if you're going to ask any questions, please do use the Q&A function, and there's a few of us looking at that to make sure we collate all those questions at the end. This is being recorded, and obviously it's live on YouTube at the moment, and it will also be recorded for that purpose. We'll put it out on our YouTube channel and link to it on the RQA website for our newsletters after as well. If you do want to discuss any of what the panel talk about during the session after the event, then we have got our own COVID-19 discussion forum. There's also relevant discussion forums for the GxP if it's something specific to that. So by all means, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Please carry it on the RQA website. And there's a bit of a disclaimer at the bottom. So just let you know that all these presentations were derived from an informal dialogue around clinical trial continuity related to COVID-19. They don't represent a policy or position on behalf of any company participating in the discussion. Each participating company is accountable for its own decisions and actions on how best to address clinical trial continuity in response to COVID-19. And before we move on, from the RQA office, I'd like to thank the different panelists that we've got coming on today. They've spent a lot of time and effort putting this on, so we really appreciate it. So thanks a lot. Hope you enjoy the event. Thanks, Samira.
Thank you, Carl. Yes, thank you. So as Carl said, absolutely, the conversation doesn't stop here. So if there's anything you want to continue, by all means. Here's the panelists and all of us working from home. So some really nice pictures here. We have Glenn, Michael and myself on the left from the GCP stream. We have Joanne and Matt from IT. Jana and Andrew will cover the GVP, and Sven will cover the GLP and the Veterinary GCP. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we've put together these slides covering the hot topics. So collectively, we will go through each of the GxPs. At the bottom, you see these bars running across the GxPs, which are underlying themes or common topics that you will see being discussed across the different GxPs. In particular, if you look at risk management, with the regulatory guidance updates that are being released, there is a lot of focus on risk management and how the important role it has to play with any changes that you make, any decisions that are being made right now in the ongoing phase as we manage the COVID situation, but also in the recovery phase once all of this settles down and is business back to usual. When you look back, you want to have adequate documentation to say how were these risks assessed, discuss them with your sponsor, what were the decisions made, what was the mitigation put in place, and above all, and absolutely above all, is subject safety takes precedence. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Michael to walk us through GCP. Michael, is that okay?
Thank you, Samira.
Thank you.
My name is Michael Smith. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm part of the strategic advice team within AstraZeneca's QA group. I'm also chairman of the GCP committee at the moment. So I'll pick up on some of the themes that Samira brought in there, actually, as it relates to the GCP area and the continuity in clinical trials. And then I'll do that before I jump into some of the detail of some of the practical considerations that this crisis has thrown up for us. So thank you, Sarah. So just before I jump to those points, and again, to emphasize what we all try to keep in mind, most of all, is that subject safety is our first consideration in all of these measures. Anything and everything we can do to preserve the immediate safety of subjects, then the site staff and the sponsor and vendor staff working on the trials, those are the priority. And it's already available, so GCP already allows for immediate implementation of measures to preserve the safety of subjects, and we need to remember to follow those. And we can also make sure that between us and the trial sites, we continue and specifically monitor any emerging adverse event SAE information, any dose modifications, to make sure that those essential parts of the trial conduct are not being missed or affected by the restrictions and the disruption that the COVID situation is causing. And that leads us into remembering that we need to make sure that whatever we try to put in place with our vendors, with our sites, that we do what we can to minimize the impact on those investigator sites, most of which are in the healthcare systems in their individual countries and are extremely stretched right now. So we need to make sure we keep balance in the mitigations we're trying to put in place. Samira's mentioned the importance of risk management, and if we didn't understand it before, then we certainly understand the importance of good risk management now, and perhaps this will be an amazingly unexpected but huge test of our risk management capability. So today we'll focus on maintaining continuity in existing and upcoming trials. It's not to say that there isn't a new task that's come now, and that is actually quickly developing and implementing a program to research and find vaccines and treatments for for coronavirus and COVID-19. For example, I was reading recently that something called the COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator Initiative has brought together a lot of organizations, a lot of companies, with the catalyst of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to really work together on finding a solution. Samira pointed to documentation, and that will really what we'll have left when this crisis is over and things begin to get back to what we used to remember as normal. All we'll have left is the decisions we made and how well we documented. So tools such as decisions and issue logs, risk logs, updated study management plans, formal deviations and changes to our procedural documents, they'll all be necessary to maintain well throughout this whole process. When it comes to risk-based quality management, now is the time to make use of those previously identified critical to quality factors and quality tolerance limits that we've been working on recently. Use those CTQs, critical to qualities and tolerance limits. If you use an integrated quality risk management plan, use those to adapt to the new situation and to follow it carefully. And even if you don't use something formally recognized as an IQRMP, or you don't have those critical data identified, then this is a chance to do that now to make the best priorities and the best decisions at the moment. And of course, then we can focus on those critical to quality assessments in the trial design and the data that come out of those to make sure that we stay on top of safety for subjects, and we can try and keep as much as possible to trial integrity and to maintain the trial objectives. So know where those CTQ, those key risk indicators, know where those data come from. And if you expect any delays in data entry at investigator sites, for example, how will that affect your ability to monitor the evolving situation, to spot where the impact and the risks are emerging in your trials? And if you're using those indicators, use them to monitor site performance and use them to flag sites that may be struggling, and also to watch for new trends as we follow the implementation of the mitigation measures. If you were doing 100% SDV before, this may be a time to reconsider and decide whether or not actually a mix of SDV and source document review or some other kind of monitoring methodology is suitable, not just for now, but also for that important period after the restrictions start to ease. So moving to the specific points on the slide around clinical trials, in terms of continuity in particular, and with an eye on subject safety. One of the first impacts that we'll realize is that it's simply not possible to maintain the study visit schedule as it was intended before. So changes will be necessary because patients can't access investigator sites. Staff will be increasingly less available at sites to actually work on those study assessments. So we need to figure out what priorities can be given to the assessment of safety and the maintenance of the important trial objectives to make sure that the patients remain in good care and we get at least credible data for the key objectives in the trial. So we might, for example, advise the sites to focus on alternative ways of keeping in touch with the patients, whether that be through telephone or Skype visits or even postal interactions to keep in contact with sites and to understand their progress. But they could at least focus on collecting safety information, so adverse events, serious adverse events. Maintain a focus on information around study drug dosing, make sure we spot any gaps in drug dosing. Concomitant medication data may be some of the more important data, and any other data that may be possible to capture remotely compared to the in-person patient visits that were first imagined. Now, we know that this situation will throw up all kinds of deviations from the protocol, and we know that the regulators have recognized this. And it seems to be a practical solution emerging to find a way to systematically treat and tag those deviations that are specifically caused by the COVID-19 disruption so that they can be systematically triaged and assessed and accounted for later on in the data management and the study writing process. And the regulators have shown some recognition that will be necessary, and they expect us to be able to account for the deviations that came out of this situation. Sites should maintain frequent remote contact with the patients, and that's something we should be aiming to do with our investigator sites as well, and find different ways of maintaining a dialogue with the sites subject to that site's other priorities as part of the healthcare system. There are indications from the regulatory guidance which is already emerging around how to think about changes to the trial in terms of protocol amendments and substantial amendments. I won't delve deep into those now, but there does seem to be some more flexible thinking from the regulators around what could constitute a substantial amendment in the EU regulatory process. And I think FDA has also given some guidance about how to approach that, such that they remain in touch with key changes in the trial, but that they don't necessarily become overwhelmed with all the multitude of changes that sponsors are contemplating right now. One message is clear, that protocol waivers were unacceptable before and they remain unacceptable now. So prospectively agreeing for deviations from the protocol is something the regulators are reminding us we cannot move back to. In terms of managing clinical trial samples, I think there's been some success, particularly for what I've seen in the central lab community, in finding alternative transport routes for samples, such that they can try to get the samples to the central laboratories within the windows of the sample viability, assuming that the site was able to take any samples in the first place, of course. And there may be other ways that we can keep on top of sample viability, or it may be possible to default to local analysis for particularly important analysis, where a central lab option is not available to the sites. And every situation seems to be different and evolving in individual countries. So sponsors and their central lab partners will need to follow that closely to maintain as much of business as usual as possible. On the subject of retaining subjects, I mean, we all recognize that it's a very disruptive period, and to keep patients in the trial, in many cases, would benefit them. It would certainly benefit the scientific integrity of the trial, but particularly it depends on the capability of the sites to maintain that contact with the patients and to understand what is reasonable and possible in this very disruptive situation. Those of you that are working on trials that have employed online or digital health ways of keeping in touch with patients may find patient engagement and retention, you have more possibilities already there waiting for you to be used. If I move on to maintaining data integrity, it's interesting. One of the first mitigations that was suggested was to do more remote SDV, so source document verification of medical records at sites. And a consensus quickly emerged, I felt, that this may not be the best solution unless those arrangements are already in place and you have a well worked out process to take care of any patient privacy breach concerns that may involve. It could be too risky to instigate that now at short notice. And in fact, the EMA points out that it's not possible to do that in many EU member states according to local requirements and regulations. What is more encouraged is to do increased centralized monitoring and remote monitoring. So we can do more and we can do different central monitoring activities that can compensate for the lack of on-site source document verification to redress the balance somewhat. And that may be more effective overall than trying to find potentially risky ways to put in ad hoc remote SDV possibilities. There are other ways that we can help sites to keep on top of the data and maintain the integrity where possible. So in the changed arrangements that may be coming from data management departments about how to deal with new data and changes and events related to COVID-19, to give guidance to those and also to the sites about how to enter those best into the case record form would really be appreciated and effective. We could also look at those pre-programmed auto queries to figure out which ones are really necessary right now. Maybe some of them are not as relevant now as they were before, or they could be deprioritized in favor of other things. And there may be specific new data monitoring, data completeness and centralized monitoring reports that can be developed specifically to compensate for the COVID-19 situation and to allow for any gaps we have of on-site monitoring and other activities that can help redress the balance. In terms of companies and sponsors' overall strategies for their development programs, what we're seeing is that they need to identify trials that, for example, are approaching an interim or a final data lock and give priority to activities to make sure that they can stay on track. It either would be for a final analysis, it may even be for a particularly important point in the trial, such as a dose escalation meeting or a data monitoring committee. Those can be given priority over other things when resources are dwindling. Those considerations can take into account the critical to quality data, and they can assess the availability of good SDV or SDR coverage of those data and records supporting them. And they can make some new assumptions regarding what is the cutoff point in terms of open queries or data which need to be verified in some way that will either allow us to lock the data at risk and document that risk assumption, or it may lead to a decision to delay the lock until those data can be verified more robustly. Sponsors now, we're seeing in the public domain, are beginning to release, having considered their overall development strategies and priorities. They've started to release statements about how they will approach any ongoing and new trials, and maybe they will be delaying or moving recruitment in some trials. They may be delaying startup of other trials in favor of those which are seen to be a priority and which also reflect the, shall we say, changing resources available in investigator sites that are primarily focused on treating patients with COVID-19 infections right now. So I think at that point, I think it's a good moment to move over to Glenn, who's going to talk to us about IMP supply chain and also the impact on audits and inspection programs.
Thanks, Michael. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm from Celgene, which is now a part of the BMS organisation. And as Michael said, I'm going to talk firstly about IMP. I am also going to talk later on about GMP because we have some GMP slides there, but I will come and talk about that later on. If we can go back to the slide before, thank you. So in terms of the IMP supply chain, I never thought I would say this. Everyone thought Brexit was a terrible experience, and now we've had stockpiles of drugs which have actually come in quite handy with the COVID-19 situation. So a little bit different from the way we're setting these slides out. I couldn't resist putting in Brexit there in relation to the stockpiling. So the fact that we do have IMP stockpiled, I think, is a good thing. With respect to some of the risks, clearly site investigator, site staff being able to not being able to receive or dispense drug is an issue. We know, obviously, with the situation, CRA is actually physically being on site to check the IMP is an issue. So what is being explored at the moment is the distribution of the IMP to the patient homes. Now, what I'd strongly suggest is that you check the local laws in relation to that. There's a lot of information out there. So there's things like, obviously, considering the patient consent to receive it directly at home. You also need to look at what the security of that IMP distribution is. You may have temperature controls. Is the patient willing to sign for the drug at home? If they don't sign, or how do you as a company ensure that that patient has got the drug? How is it being stored at their home? These are a number of things to kind of look at. The other thing that I wanted to mention on IMP supply chain, I am slightly mindful of time, is the IWRS. We use these systems, I would say, not to their full capacity. And wherever you are in your companies, I would look at the capabilities that that system has, because you can do a lot of remote IMP status records on that, whether it is looking at what's being dispensed, what's being distributed, what the stock levels are. It even goes down to the returns and the destruction. So you may not be aware of it, but I would strongly advise that you look at your IRT, the IWRS, in terms of the entire supply chain and how that's being tracked. I will come on and talk about audits and inspections before we move on to the next slide. So I'm sure there's people on the call that are dealing with audits, and certainly we're all dealing with inspections. I'll maybe talk about audits first, in that clearly the focus with COVID-19 is to look at what's business critical, and hopefully those business critical audits can proceed in a remote capacity. If they can't proceed remotely, then you need to obviously align with the business in terms of when best to do that audit, and thinking about obviously future plans. In terms of some of the audits, for example, something like a process audit, a document audit may be fairly easy to do remotely, but going to an investigator site or to an affiliate or local operating office could be difficult. So that's clearly an issue. And with respect to inspections, there's a lot of uncertainty. Certainly there was about inspections and what the regulators are doing. There's a lot of regulatory bodies that have released further guidance now in terms of certainly any inspections that are face-to-face being postponed. But there's a lot of regulatory bodies now talking about virtual inspections. And again, I would strongly suggest that you look at the material from the regulatory body wherever you are. Just coming back to the audits, a couple of things I would say is that clearly the focus is on looking at your audits in the short term as we go through COVID-19. So for example, looking ahead at the next 3 months and what your audit plan is. So clearly we're having to react to this as a QA compliance area. The one thing I would say is also be smart with your teams and look at where they can focus their time if they're unable to do audits. So things like CAPAs, there may be compliance projects that the staff could do. And I would also add that be very mindful of audits being backed up to Q3, Q4, and then you're unable to meet your audit plan. So you should start thinking now in terms of the audits that maybe are not high risk and you've pushed back, and actually looking at it from a strategic perspective to see if some of those audits should actually occur. And I'll maybe stop at that point, and I think hand it over to Samira. Is that correct?
Samira,
Thank you, Glenn.
We do have a few questions to share quickly.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So thank you, Glenn, and thanks for the questions coming in as well. So just to echo what you were saying on inspections, Glenn, so from Sweden, we have a point that we know that EMA are at least considering switching to remote virtual sponsor inspections for those inspection programs triggered by applicant submissions for new licenses. One of the questions was, what's the position regarding uploading of some source documents by the site team to the eCRF verification by the CRA and then deleting it after the pandemic is over? Well, I think that quickly became clear that that kind of ad hoc arrangement is not encouraged. In fact, it's really strongly discouraged, and it may even be not possible according to some local regulations. So it wouldn't seem to be an acceptable short-term solution to have images of those source documents uploaded or faxed or sent to the sponsor in any way through the eCRF or some other means. So I think we'd need to default to some of the other alternatives we've spoken about, including changing the way that remote and centralized monitoring may compensate for the lack of those eyes-on medical records. Second question was, a lot of companies are introducing something called home health services. So in other words, for active studies to replace patient site visits, keeping in mind the regulator's view that the investigator needs to remain in oversight of all of the activities in relation to patients management. How are companies managing that with respect to making sure it's not an extra burden on sites, and maybe taking care of changing the protocol or the consent document or the contract or anything else that is affected by the use of those home help services. So has anyone got direct experience of discussions or arrangements that are starting to be put in place for those patient-facing services? And that can include, by the way, participants who are joining us remotely. If you have any experience about tackling that, then please enter that into the chat or the Q&A window, and we'll share that. And I think, just as from a general point of view, that the agencies that expect the investigators to remain in oversight would understand some of the different arrangements that had their focus on maintaining continuity and patient treatment. So long as there was a good process in place, I hope they might take account of the fact that some of those arrangements were made and overseen centrally by the sponsor compared to everything being in the hands of the investigator. And finally, some countries are now requested that you drop your package at home without a signature of the recipients. I'm guessing this might be a reference to IMP or to kits to avoid contact, so that there may not be a documented drop-off. And a solution could be to follow up with a phone call or an email by the site and capture that interaction as some record of the safe delivery of the kit, for example. That's an interesting solution. Thank you.
Yeah, Michael, I think just to add to that, I think also there may be patients and families in self-isolation as well. So this comes back to the point that Rob Recht and I also made, that you need to think about how you ensure that the patient receives that IMP. So yeah, valid points.
Thank you, Samira. I think we need to give time to the other GxPs.
Yes, agreed. If you switch to the next slide real quick. Thank you. In the interest of time, I won't go through the details, but you should have this material. So what we've done is we've summarized the key regulations and what the guidances are. It's evolving. As we know, the EMA released the guidance on the 27th, so last Friday. We had something come from the PMDA yesterday. So I think what I'll do is, and maybe if we switch to the next slide, you should have the links. So you should have the links of the different agencies and the guidances, and just a couple of points on the similarities and differences. As we've mentioned, across all the guidances, when you read the recommendations, it focuses on three main areas: assuring subject safety, maintaining compliance with GCP, and minimizing the risk to data integrity. Risk assessment, as Michael mentioned, is extremely key. How that is done and how that is documented is something to absolutely bear in mind. Protocol deviations, again, is something that's certainly called out in the guidances, and Michael's talked about that. The differences or the specifics that are released, say for example, with the EMA guidance, there was a mention of an option to transfer subjects across the site. So rather than having to travel a far distance, maybe have the inter-site transfer and transfer of IMP. It can be implemented as an urgent safety measure initially, but followed by a substantial amendment. The Czech Republic, for instance, has strongly advised sponsors to not initiate new trials or new patients on their trials. Similarly, the US FDA guidance also provides a really good summary. And sorry, if you go back to the previous slide, sorry to do this, on what the options are when you look at your ongoing patients and new trials. So hopefully this slide can summarize, and we've tried to bucket them in different areas to tell you what the regulatory guidance out there is. The absolute last take-home message from my slide is this is evolving. Please look out for online material. Things are changing almost on a weekly basis. So it's something that I strongly encourage you to look at, and certainly ask any questions on the COVID forum. So I think, Michael, if you've taken the questions, maybe we can then move to the next GxP, which is the GVP area.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So Jana and Andrew, over to you.
Okay, let me introduce myself. So I'm Jana Hiankova. I am an employee of Pharmacovigilance. My role within Pharmacovigilance is a head of PV systems and regulatory intelligence department. At the same time, I'm serving as an EU QPPV for a couple of clients, and I'm also involved in auditing of third parties. So that's my introduction. Andy, maybe you might want to introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Andrew Cooper. I'm from Pharmacovigilance Quality Assurance at GSK.
Okay, so let me continue with a very short presentation. Which was prepared in cooperation with Andy. So the first thing that we have to do now in pharmacovigilance is task prioritization. So we can ensure activities that are under legal deadlines. At the same time, we might identify activities that might be postponed or prioritized. Then we have to consider local legislative requirements. And here I'm speaking about legislative requirements worldwide, because there are some requirements within EU, but we have to take in mind or keep in mind also requirements worldwide to be able to fulfill compliance. And of course, we have to evaluate also risk of non-compliance and follow also ad hoc instructions of regulatory authorities. So you can see that there are quite a lot of topics, points that we have to follow to ensure pharmacovigilance activities. And looking at key tasks for pharmacovigilance, So we have to ensure daily business. So it means submission or reporting of individual case safety reports. Then we have to continue in signal detection and evaluation, and of course also aggregate report production and submission. For some companies, it might be very important to consider also prioritization of products. If you know that there is, let's say, old product, so it means that you don't have to pay that much attention to these products, while when you have new products, when you are originator company, so you should pay attention to new products and you should prioritize them. Okay, can we move to the next slide? Here we have legislative requirements, and these requirements didn't change within COVID-19, let's say, period. And pharmacovigilance has an impact on public health. Pharmacovigilance has clear legislative requirements for emergency, and these are defined. You can find Commission implementing regulation number 520/2012. And here the legislation is mentioning that the marketing authorization holder shall provide appropriate instructions on the process to be used in case of urgency, including business continuity. And in module 1 of GxP, there are critical pharmacovigilance processes and business continuity in chapter 1B11.3. So this is legislation that is not specifically focused on the current situation, but we might or we should follow the legislation. So we have to ensure, as I already mentioned, 1590 calendar days timeline for electronic transmission of individual case safety reports from any source. And this is what is, these points are mainly taken from the legislation, and you can see that it might be sometimes tricky nowadays. Then timely electronic submission of periodic safety update reports via PCR repository, and there are 70 or 90 calendar days depending on the PCR period. Then we have to ensure signal management and continuous safety profile monitoring and benefit risk evaluation of authorized medicinal products. So these are crucial activities, of course, for critical pharmacovigilance processes. You might refer to a specific module, but now we have really prioritized what and how to ensure. I have to say that in pharmacovigilance, at least in our company, almost all people are working from their homes. So far, we didn't see any interruption of business, which is great. I believe that it's going to be like this also in the future. But of course, we have to communicate a lot with all stakeholders, with our employees, etc., to be able to ensure the business continuity. So these are legislative requirements in EU, and then legislative requirements US. So it was prepared by Andrew. So maybe Andy, if you can.
Sure. Go to the next slide then. So the FDA published very recently guidance for how to manage pharmacovigilance in a pandemic, and I think from a reading perspective, that provides a very practical guide to how you need to manage it as a company, and it certainly gives you a step-by-step process on how this should be managed. And I think the key part really is that you need to develop a continuity of operations plan, or COOP as you like, which is probably a bit easier to say. And really what this really needs to consider are the activities that are directly relevant for the processing and submission of cases to the FDA. So which parts of your system are intrinsically involved in getting 15-day reports to the FDA? And then how are you going to then manage that within your PV site? So normally at most pharma companies, work is achieved throughout the world. It's not necessarily just one particular site in one country. There are multiple sites involved. And so which sites are going to be effective and how, I guess. And then there's the concept of, which came up in GCP, if you're unable to perform activities. And I think this is really key. You know, when do you raise deviations against your PV system, and how does that documentation look? And if you fall over because of the fact that, you know, one of your sites goes completely down and you can't lift and shift activities, then, you know, you do need to inform the FDA. And as part of the guidance, the FDA have provided a really good method of prioritizing what's important to report to them. So if you find that your system is suffering, then you need to be able to expedite certain cases in advance of others. And also you need to consider the element of how recently your products were first registered. So looking at new products which have got an emerging safety profile themselves, and when they first came to the market. And normally what we're looking at here is products that have came to market in the first 3 years. And so anybody who's got a marketing authorizations in the FDA, which is pretty much everybody these days, this is a really handy, useful step-by-step guide that the FDA have published, and I recommend you all obviously read it. So if we go to the next slide, Jan, if you want me to continue.
But if you are fine, so I will continue. Of course, if you want to add something, so I'm happy. How to ensure PV compliance? Of course, you will have to go to management and do their responsibility to follow business continuity plan. Again, as it was already mentioned here in the previous presentation, so it is really good testing for our business continuity plan, because you can see how our business continuity is ensured. Of course, you can also later take lessons learned, and you can also adapt your business continuity plan if you find any gaps from this. But as I mentioned already, so for us at least, I was really surprised that if we are working remotely, so we can ensure business very well, and this is something what we of course didn't test that deeply as we are doing it right now, but at least we can see that it's been working. Of course, you have to set up priorities when the situation arises, and again, I might say that for now we don't have such a situation that we would need to prioritize. We can cover all the business, all the PV business. Of course, nobody knows how the situation is gonna develop, so we will see. But so far, so good. It might happen that we will need to allocate crucial duties, backups, staff, depending on the disease. We are already monitoring staff performance, and I have to say that we got an instruction to follow our people of course, closer than usual, and we have to follow our people on daily basis. So it might be some similar situation in your company as well. And of course, communication between management and staff, timely, short, transparent, otherwise you won't get what you need to get in your business. And I just put here example how to set up a business continuity plan. So identify staff unable to work and critical number to function. So it means to have an idea of how much time you need for certain activity to ensure it. And especially as we mentioned, the critical activities like ICSR reporting, or aggregate reporting. So these are really crucial signal management. So you have to be sure that you might ensure this or business continuity in this field. If you can't, so testing and ensuring working from home, I think that nowadays this is done from almost all of us. Organize teleconferences instead of face-to-face meetings. So again, you have to be transparent, you have to be short and clear in your messages. So this is different to face-to-face. And if necessary, so you can even centralize somehow PV activities. For example, point of contact for PV is necessary. So meaning if you have affiliates, you have to cover also affiliates. So you might cover it also, for example, from headquarters. So you really need to think about key crucial activities and how to keep business continuity in these crucial activities. Andy, maybe you would like to add something?
I think you have to really work on the, what's possible on a periodic basis and keep reviewing elements. And I think as we all have global companies, each with their national authorization with slightly different pharmacovigilance requirements, as the GCP guys said, keep watching out for notifications that come through from the agencies, and because it may be possible to do things in a different way, and also some elements of say handing in case reports by physical means will not be possible, and they may want to start batching up reports towards the end of the pandemic period. But I think key activity is watching what the regulations do as well. And one element to consider also is that a lot of companies have got many physicians and healthcare professionals that work in pharmacovigilance and in GCP, and some of those individuals who may be registered as continue their registration may wish to go back and help out or practice medicine in this period. And so we need to consider those elements of staff not just being unable to work because of sickness and illness, or having to look after them, be a carer themselves, but also some of our healthcare professionals may also wish to go back into frontline medical care. So that could also have an impact onto what we do.
Yeah, and I would like to add that really you have to follow legislation or instructions of health authorities on daily basis, and we agreed that the most crucial information would go to all employees on daily basis if necessary. And you can see that, for example, some authorities informed about certain types of submissions, certain email addresses, change of paper submission to electronic submission, meaning specific email address. So you have to follow really web pages of or information from national competent authorities to cover your daily business.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jana and Andy. Are there any questions for the PV committee? I am conscious of time and we have about 4 more GxPs to go through.
No, we don't see any at the moment. I think people are still processing. Thanks, Samira.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, if we move to the next slide, I think it's GMP. Great. Glenn, are you able to take over, please?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Glenn.
Okay, good. Okay, so firstly, I won't take the credit for these slides. We did have our GMP committee that put these slides together. I've just been asked to present these as best I can, so I will do my best. If we go to the well, actually, before we go to the next slide, I think we've touched on a little bit of this with GCP, and this was from the GMP, that their main concern was the continuity of supply of IMP to patients. So we haven't covered that at top level, but I'm going to go into that in more detail. We go to the next slide. So some of the risks to the supply chain. So the shipping to the sites and depots, I think this can be differentiated in terms of within a single country or region, with respect to the sites versus shipping to depots when that's obviously across countries. So I spoke a little bit about shipping to sites early on in the GCP bit. I think the bits that have been listed here, availability of couriers, and obviously the choice of couriers is important. Availability of staff to receive stock at sites. I have spoken about obviously the rules relaxing along the lines of being able to send the drug directly to the patients, and obviously some of the concerns and risks regarding that. And I think there's been some questions in the chat about that. One point I would make in terms of some of these risks is I think now is the time to utilize your risk assessment tools in order to guide you through the best process. This is not ideal, but I think you need to use those in addition to the local regulations. Shipping to depots, so obviously delays at borders is going to be an issue because certainly in terms of the lockdown between some of the countries and goods going in and out, there's clearly fewer flights. So certainly we need to think of different forms of transport. And again, the availability of couriers internationally. In terms of the manufacturing, now clearly staff availability is a big one in terms of having staff that are off due to illness, or they may be in a lockdown situation, they may have to be self-quarantined. Do need to look at obviously availability of key staff. I'll come on and talk about the mitigation in a bit with some of this. Essential equipment maintenance delays as specialists are unable to travel, minimizing the risk to staff. Obviously, there is the social distancing that we're all aware of, but how do we minimize the risk to our staff? How do we ensure that those staff are working in the best possible way in terms of the product quality, but also the safety of the people that are working? Next slide. The material supplies, so this goes into obviously things like raw materials, access to raw materials, API products. Clearly, you need to be thinking about obviously any supplies from compromised regions, especially during the ongoing situation, but also with some of the history of some of the countries. In terms of delivery dates, we need to allow or be prepared for extended delivery dates, and obviously access to key equipment as well. With respect to quality assurance, and I would include the QP here, clearly there are some areas that are of a concern. So on-site versus remote certification, you can have many people on a GMP QP, or sorry, one person on a GMP QP license, but you may have many people behind the scenes doing that. So you need to look at the most pragmatic way of managing that process, maintaining the GMP compliance. You know, obviously, and I think there was a question on this in the chat, product quality is paramount, and I think it is easy to get sidetracked or get distracted by some of the wider things that are going on. The data integrity, I know Michael's spoken about the data integrity, and I think you know, Matt's also going to be talking about this in terms of paper and electronic, and things like e-signatures. Obviously, securing remote access could be an issue. And on-site access for audits, we've spoken a little bit about audits, but audits in the GMP space, clearly they are going to be hindered with the current situation. Next slide. Okay, so some of the mitigation steps. So I think clearly the GMP committee have highlighted this in green, that shipping is still possible. There could be delays experienced, but you know, shipping is occurring. Clearly, we do need to look at sites or countries where there are bigger obstacles with the current situation. A few mitigation steps to which I think are key ones to highlight for me. Preloading sites. You can also be looking at reducing the number of shipments. When you do ship, you ship at a higher volume, so you're not doing more shipments, you're doing less, but with more stock. In terms of the IRT, I have spoken about the IRT and the fact that the systems that we use should be used more vigorously. I'd say from a supply chain perspective, the people in your companies will know the ins and outs of these systems, and certainly from a GCP perspective, I think people in that space can learn from our supply chain colleagues in the GMP area. Different solutions for different types of studies and perhaps different countries, I think that's fairly obvious. And also consider how the medication will be moved from site to patient if the visits do not occur. I think we've also spoken about the fact that site to site transfer could be a possibility if the risk is deemed lower than obviously the risk that we would normally have in a usual situation. Again, in terms of temperature excursion, it's a case clearly that there's going to be some risks here, but if you're talking about medication which is not strictly controlled from a temperature perspective, having some medication may be better than not having anything at all. If we go to the next slide. In terms of the manufacturing, so clearly things like can the shelf life of current stock be extended? You know, don't just revert to the additional shipping. Often products can be extended, and clearly there needs to be a process about doing that. Contingency in terms of staffing levels, I think, is important. You're going to have people that, as I said, are off sick. They may have to self-isolate. It's important to look at things like lone worker processes. You know, do companies and vendors have a process behind this? The key, while we're talking about vendors, I think this is an important thing, not just for manufacturing vendors, but every vendor that we use across the GxPs. We have various key performance indicators, but now's the time to think out the box. So you have to change those key performance indicators so that you're targeting areas of the vendor performance based on the current situation with COVID. So I think that's a really, really important point to make across the GxPs. And then use available data to assess if equipment maintenance schedules can be extended. I spoke about the fact that people that are servicing some of the equipment may not be able to get out to the manufacturers. So often it is possible to extend those schedules and obviously consider alternative procedures to enable working from home. Again, I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Next slide. So the material supply, so things like the raw materials, the API, you know, if there is a need to delay, obviously that's one option. Clearly, there has to be communication and conversations with the suppliers, so that the material supply is being tracked. People are looking at the mitigating the risks with the current situation, and also what alternative sources are available for that particular material. With respect to quality assurance, there's a few things to touch on here, and I think for the purpose of time, I'm not going to go for all of these, but things like deviation systems and change management principles when defining workarounds is important. And I would stress that it's important to look at that now, but also when we come out of the current situation and how we deal with those deviations and change management, change control at a later date. And I know, as I've touched on briefly, now is the time to be using critical thinking. I do think now is the time for the mindset of our colleagues to be refreshed in terms of critical thinking, and also utilizing those risk management tools that you have to assess any mitigation steps. And I think that's it for me. If we go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, no, it isn't. You can tell that I didn't put these slides together, so apologies for that. So guidance, there's some obviously guidance from the MHRA in terms of on-site inspections. As I said, I think a lot of this has moved on to now how remote assessments are being done by regulatory authorities. So this is changing day by day. So I would suggest you look at this. And yeah, expect to experience office-based inspections. I think that's fairly obvious. I think the point in green is paramount in terms of you know, no need to change GMP compliance. GMP compliance is still critical. It really is, as I said, working around some of these obstacles so that we can ensure the best possible compliance in terms of the product quality. And I think there's some links to the guidances there for people's reference, and I believe that is the last slide for GMP.
Well done, Glenn. We do, so Mary, we do have one question from the GMP, which Glenn may help us to cover. So Glenn, this came in from somebody watching on YouTube. In a situation where a site is closed during this pandemic and a subject needs to get IMP or IP, can the sponsor arrange shipment of IP directly from the subject to the subject from the depot by the sponsor? So I'm thinking you answer in terms of shipping to patients, but also remember that the question was the site was closed. So I'm wondering who's looking after the patient.
Yeah, I think, as I said, I think this is where I would strongly suggest you check the local legislation. There, certainly this is a consideration, but as we spoke about earlier on in both the clinical and the GMP setting, is that there's various risks with providing product directly to the patient. But you know, clearly that is an option, but also things like the IRT, IWRS, clearly the supply chain and the compliance of that supply chain can't be broken. So there's options to do that, but as I said, I would strongly suggest local legislation is checked and contingencies of plans are put in place to ensure that that product is shipped correctly, received correctly, stored correctly, etc.
Thank you. We have a couple more. So Norway is allowing use of expired medications in an emergency, and the question is, who would be responsible for allowing the expired stock to be used? And also, same person is asking about the assessment of stability. I suppose whether or not we've got any data that would allow for extended use based on evolving stability data. So any thoughts on either of those points?
I mean, maybe the first point, and I'll open up to everyone else, because as I said, I do cover GxP, but I'm not a true GMP expert. But I would suggest that the QP is the one that would be able to sign off on any expired medication that would be extended or allowed in emergencies. You know, the normal way is to extend that expiry date. And obviously there would be a process to follow that. In terms of additional assessments of stability and what extra risks, it's probably not fair for me to comment on that, but I don't know if anyone else wants to add, either on the panel or in the chat. Feel free to do that.
Thank you, Glenn. We have one more, what looks very technical question that we might default to our GMP colleagues to follow up after the call as well. But the question is out there in the question and answer window if anyone on any of the attendees want to answer it, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michael. Great. Can I now hand over to Joanne and Matt, please, for the IT piece?
Okay, thanks, Samira.
Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Morning, afternoon, all of that. So I'm going to cover the IT session. So first, I'll introduce myself. I'm Joanne Donald. I currently work at Roche in computer systems strategy. So next slide, please. What we decided to do was, so I'm going to start with, from the perspective of a large pharmaceutical company, how we've been working over the past few weeks once the pandemic kind of kicked in and lockdown kicked in. And then my colleague Matt is going to cover how smaller pharmaceutical companies have been addressing the pandemic from an IT perspective. Okay, so the main difference, the real main difference, is most people who can be are at home, working at home, working virtually, working individually, not with your colleagues, not with your peers. Okay. What we found at Roche, so these are just some of our data, but it could be any large pharmaceutical company. It's the same thing. We're all in it together. We're all just doing the same things. It's very similar. It's very leveling, this pandemic. We're all kind of at home. We're all maybe homeschooling, caring for people, all of the rest. We're all in it together. Anyway, here's some data from Roche. We found the first couple of weeks ago, that the service desk issues went up by 60%. And that was basically lots of people who hadn't been working from home, going home, logging on, trying to get into various systems, and IT helping them get set up. I believe that's really dropped now. Thank goodness, IT are saying. We also found a couple of weeks ago that our VPN usage went up by about 400%. So everybody was using the VPN to access their systems. And so the users went up from 38,000 accessing the VPN to about 82,000. So again, IT are like, oh my goodness, that's a lot of people at the one time. Found that the virtual meetings have really increased up to 300%. Lots of like this, lots of use of Zoom. We use Hangouts, but lots of use of virtual meetings, teleconferences, calls, all of that. Found that some of our external partners have also, because different countries, a global company, as a lot of you are, have initiated work from home policies, but they weren't set up for it. So we sent out laptops and we set up the security for those, IT have told me. The first week, a few weeks ago, one of the first communications that went around was, you don't have to use the VPN for everything, because we were clogging up the VPN. You didn't have to use it for everything. So it turns out you don't have to use it for general things like email and calendar. It's for really restricted access, you use the VPN. So that was a change. So we're not clogging up the VPN. I spoke to, I want to get our title correctly, to the head of strategic initiatives for IT last week, and asked how it was going. She said, in general, it's going pretty well, considering. And the reason she said it was going so well is we've had a business continuity plan team in place for 12 years. or they've been planning for scenarios, not this scenario, believe me, not this scenario, no one saw this coming, but planning for scenarios where we'd all be off site, we'd all have to use our laptops, whatever. They've planned for it, they've got the technology in place, and they've rehearsed it. So in general, it's gone really well. And she said it was generally business as usual due to preparedness policy. So all that investment upfront seems to have paid off for now. So that's where we are right now. So over the past couple of weeks, there's a big emphasis on connecting virtually. I think you'll all agree we're all social beings. I'm missing the face-to-face, the real people. I still have got family around me, I'm very lucky, but we're social beings, so we need to connect, we need to talk. How do you feel? How are you getting on? So we've been encouraged to reach out, phone people, have teleconferences, have VTCs like this, and even just check in, how are you, how's it going? Then eventually move on to work, but just connect. It's a funny time, so we've been really encouraged with the technology to connect. Okay. And the priority has been and continues to be the safety and well-being of ourselves and our family first. Make sure, as the old oxygen mask scenario, so make sure you're safe and well, your family are well, then you'll have the energy and you'll have the strength to look out for your priority tasks in your company, and you'll be effective and be well in the coming weeks. So once you're safe and well, concentrate on essential tasks for patient safety. So for the clinical trials, and concentrate on maintaining the clinical trials. I meant to say at the start, obviously people who are in GMP manufacture, which has been covered, they'll be coming in. So well done them, and it's brilliant that they are. So they still have to come in, they're not working virtually. Our also priority is health authority approvals, unmet needs. So trying to keep these clinical trials going for these nasty diseases that are really going to help people in the longer term. Last week, there was a guidance that came out for non-invasive remote monitoring devices from the FDA. And again, just a more pragmatic approach in the current situation, that if you're using some devices or some data and it's supplementary, it's supporting data, yeah, you can use it. They're going to not enforce it as much. So I put the link there. Okay, next slide, please. So some common areas across the GxPs, we're starting to see themes already. When I was listening to my peers, same kind of thing. So the majority of staff are home working. If you're not in GMP manufacture, or if you're not running a study, you're actually running the study and looking after the patients. So if you're doing that, well done you. People need to do it, so that's great. IT systems are being used at high capacity, higher than people would have ever thought. Okay. Staff are unable to be physically on site to perform oversight activities. So we're using different means, phone, maybe again for a GCP study, maybe phoning, a teleconference, emails, but compliant means. I think, again, we've touched on this. So yeah, there's different ways of doing it, but it feels a bit funny and it feels a bit risky than it probably is. So so think through it and think, is it a safe way? Is it a safe way to maintain oversight? Okay, for us, it's maintaining pharmacovigilance case processing by contractors and lockdown countries. So again, sending out maybe laptops and making sure we've got oversight of those. Again, across all of us, the regulators being unable to come on site to inspect. So some of our medicines will be delayed, and maybe the approvals may not happen, or they'll be delayed, which is a real shame for unmet patient needs. So is there ways around it? Can we send in a data package? Is there different ways of doing it? And we're in current dialogue with the regulators on that. So maybe remote audits and remote inspections, what's acceptable? This is just a new way of doing it. Also, again, across all the GxPs, we're doing it, but it's just as relevant for everyone. I think people are using like KPIs, the same, it's different terminology, but using data. What data or data signals, data analytics can we use to perhaps replace an audit, or perhaps focus our areas on the higher risk areas, higher risk sites? Can we get some data from that site? Can we see is that under control without being able to physically audit them? What can we do to maintain oversight, to monitor the signals, and to give as much attention as we need to the critical areas? Okay. So that's my section. So now I'm going to hand over to Matt.
Hi, next slide, please. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Jones. I'm the owner and principal consultant at Digital Quality Associates. Our experience really within DQA is working with quite small pharmaceutical companies, IT companies, digital health and virtual clinical trial companies. The sort of scope of this is about 40 to maybe a few hundred employees, normally towards the bottom end. So these companies react in quite different ways to the large pharmaceutical companies. We thought it would be quite interesting to bring a perspective from across the range of all different sizes of companies. So for small companies, they usually have a virtual structure. So their day-to-day business isn't really that disrupted. Most people are working from home as usual. They can't go to common places for meetings, but they're fairly used to working from home and they have the infrastructure to back this up. A lot are very used to it, very small volumes of calls, very small volumes of video conferences also. So they are ticking along as per normal. However, as Joanne just explained, Roche has put a business continuity plan in place for 12 years and teams working on this constantly. For many small companies that have been in existence for 1 to 2 years, they're still really forming their business continuity and their disaster recovery plans. And some of these only actually exist for the product level, so how they provide the service and not who provides the service or how they function in times such as this. Very similarly, no one has actually had in their business continuity plans the cause of a virus that has sort of taken everybody out to home working. Amusingly, one software company I work with has a contingency plan for a zombie attack, but not a virus. Lots of small companies are in flux. They have lots of contractors, lots of temporary workers. So there's issues there with assigning priorities, with assigning IT equipment, licenses. Many employees are only there for 6 months and then handing over to another employee. So in these times, also a smaller company would find some issues during the COVID crisis of doing these handovers. And this leads on to the remote help desk. As Joanne explained within Roche, there was increased use. For a lot of small software providers, their help desk provision has gone up to 300–400%, very, very similar, with individuals trying to use services at home or trying to use services through different connections. This has led to a disruption to normal business models within these companies. They're being asked to do many, many more transactions through their systems. A good example is a company I work with providing artificial intelligence systems to assist with patient recruitment. Their call rate has gone up tenfold as we speak, and I think it's still increasing to look at different patient populations as sponsor companies try and change their protocols at the moment to accommodate the COVID crisis. One last point really with the situation, many companies use rented office space. So these are at the moment empty and desolate, places like WeWork, Regis. So they don't have physical locations, but they use areas for combined meetings, which now can't go ahead. So this is also a challenge to the smaller company where these large suppliers of rented office space are closing shop. The challenges we see, the supply and redistribution of software supplied by smaller companies, and also the requisition of those pieces of software by smaller companies. There's been a huge increase in usage, and on occasion there's been outages and downtime due to the fact that this was never expected, and this level of extrapolation into greater volumes of software distribution was never really seen or forecast for. The use of third-party vendors by smaller companies and the reliance on their expertise and response. Many larger companies now are taking up that resource for third-party vendors. So smaller companies with smaller contracts in both worlds, in the tech world and in the pharma world, are really seeing a downturn in the provision of expertise as it's being taken up by companies with larger contracts and, should we say, gold standard contracts rather than a standard contract. Commercial cloud providers are being used, and I saw a report from Amazon Web Services about 5 days ago that their provision has gone up to 140%, not technically linked to smaller companies, but just linked to more people using cloud provision for document transfer, hosting, and provision of service back to essential departments within larger companies. And this comes to the elasticity of those commercial solutions, that it's a very good option to move to some cloud services at the moment with a prudent risk-based approach to help make transactions more seamless as they have more capacity. And rather than putting capacity or transactional impact onto company systems, it is an option many companies, both small and medium-sized, are taking. I think the largest issue with small companies is downtime and loss of employee expertise. You may only have one employee that can do a particular task. Should we say in agile development, you may only have one Scrum Master who can conduct Scrum ceremonies and who can go through the daily rundown from the backlog to start the software production and to start the sprint activities. If that one employee is down or has to self-isolate or is ill for 14 days, that provides a huge amount of burden on that small company to keep functioning. And I think this really, for smaller companies, is the one big hurdle they haven't seen coming, and how to get over this of having deputies. But this, I've personally seen this in a number of my technology partners recently. And with that, I'll finish the section on small companies for IT, digital health, and pharma. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. I am conscious of time, so maybe if we move to the next section. Thank you. Sven, you able to please talk to GLP and the veterinary GCP?
Yep, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are living. My name is Sven Buckingham. I'm a QA consultant, and I'm currently chair of the RQA Animal and Veterinary Products Committee. I'm presenting GLP and Veterinary GCP because although the slides were prepared by the GLP committee, unfortunately no one from that committee could actually attend this afternoon's slot. So these aren't my slides, so thank you to those who did produce them. Technology failed me earlier because I've got cut off, so hopefully I'm going to be able to stay with you, but it just shows that sometimes technology doesn't always work, especially if you live in rural Suffolk. Next slide, please. Okay, some of this has already been covered, perks being last, that some people have already spoken about some of the challenges that are being faced. One thing perhaps to start with GLP is that the UK GLPMA have issued guidance as of yesterday on their website that talks about some of the things that they want people to think about with regards to GLP and COVID-19. And a big part of that, no surprise, is risk. So it's down to organisations to look at the risk to them and what they're doing and how it fits in with their structure. This is obviously a moving feast with the current pandemic. No one knows how long it's going to last for, despite questions being raised by journalists, etc. Who knows? We could be in it for the long haul, so it could be that companies need to rethink what they're going to do long term rather than just short term as well. So things like study conduct, from a GLP perspective, that's going to be a mix of test facility management, test site management, and the study director talking to the PIs, etc. And just deciding what you can actually do. You might not be able to look after all the animals you've got on site. Ethics coming to that, you need to be able to look after animal welfare, and obviously you don't want to cancel studies and cull animals unnecessarily. But resource might be an issue. So it's working smart, deciding what can be done, what can be put on hold, what can be delayed, etc. I've also heard of companies doing shift work, so to maintain social distancing, analysts, for instance, will come in at odd hours of day and night. The work will get done, but it means that they're coping with the physical separation, etc. But as a result of things that happen with study conduct, deviations might need to be raised, study plan amendments, and it's very much a study director oversight as what needs to be gone, and then talking to sponsors, talking to management, talking to QA, and deciding what you can do best to mitigate that. There are obviously things that study director can do remotely. We have video calls, you can have scans of data, some data can be accessed electronically, so the oversight can be maintained. And even using technology, so things like cameras. The police have body cams. I'm not saying everyone gets one of those, but something similar, something where a presence could be put into the facility but without physically being there. So it's worth looking at those kind of systems to see what you can do to mitigate one's ability to physically be on site. Study directors might be ill, they might be isolated, etc. And again, IT has been spoken about, but you've got the options for E6. The MHRA have said you can use perhaps emails as confirmation if people haven't got the ability to scan, etc. Equipment, again, it's been spoken about that one might not be able to have those routinely serviced or maintained. And again, it's down to each facility, their risk. You know your kit, you know what the equipment is being used for, how critical it is. There should be control charts, trending, you know, have the history behind you. So you might be able to defer routine maintenance and servicing, but mitigate it by doing something internally, perhaps do a more frequent check of equipment such as balances or pipettes, etc. Look at your control charts to see if you've got analytical equipment, is it starting to drift out for things like clinical pathology, etc. But again, whatever you do, document decisions, do a risk assessment, and have that really nailed down so people have made an informed decision as what's needed to be done. And again, deviations might need to be raised on a facility level or study level, or both. Materials, there will be obviously some problems with getting stuff shipped, diet, bedding, etc. Are there alternatives that you can use? If you've got things coming in from abroad perhaps, or from remote locations, are there alternatives you can use locally? And then what's the impact? Does it matter? Have you done a risk assessment? And again, probably a common thread through all of this is risk assessment. Quality assurance, GLP does have a requirement that study plans are audited, procedures are inspected, be they study-based or process-based, facilities are audited, and raw data reports are audited. Excuse me. Some things can be done remotely. You can audit study plans remotely. Bit difficult to audit procedures remotely. So again, I think it was a question that's raised in the chat, is deciding what you need to do. What is critical? Can you shift to a risk-based approach for certain activities? And it was something the MHRA have alluded to in their guidance document that came out yesterday. But you need to decide. It depends on your studies, your facility, what you're doing. So it could be a good chance to actually step back, look at it critically, and decide where the highest risk goes. And it is also business continuity. CROs, contract research organisations, will be paid by deliverance of final reports, for instance. So that might be one thing you need to factor into that. Excuse me, speaking, it's not COVID-19, honest, excuse me a minute. Again, depending on the nature of what you're doing, you might have auditors who live close to the facility, if you've got a physical facility, a laboratory-based test facility, and they might be able to come in and focus on things that are important, and maybe raise deviations if you're holding off on facility audits, etc. But if you're doing crop trials, crop protection studies, and it's in another country, you might not be able to travel. So what are you going to do? You might be able to look at maybe supplementing study-based inspections with process inspections. It could be actually reviewing what you do, how you define what your study audits are versus your process audits. And seeing if you can cover something that covers the eventualities. Excuse me, bearing in mind that with field trials in particular, often it's small organisations, 1 or 2 people, same piece of kit. So if you've seen one application, will that suffice for another study, for instance? and maybe using local contract QA. I know facilities in Europe that they physically can't travel, but someone local can actually do it. So it's maybe thinking outside the box and deciding that you might have local resource you can use, and they'll probably be quite busy. So there's probably a fair bit to think about, but again, it's risk-based. It's documenting what you do, defining what you're going to do, and deciding if it fits for purpose or not. Okay, next slide, please. Remote working has been spoken about at length, but I guess the key thing is, have they got access to it? Some small companies won't necessarily be able to have the ability to ship data out electronically, so it could be that physically got to go in there. But there might be communication that can be improved, and just altering your systems, reviewing your SOPs, raising deviations to them, to ensure that you can actually maintain effective communication, and you've got the ability to prove that people are actually doing what they should be doing. Data integrity has been covered, so I won't go through that. Data security, again, that's been pretty much covered, but again, excuse me, with often paper data being used in GLP studies, if data is being shipped to auditors to review at home, how safe is it? Have they got the ability to be kept safe and secure? Is it free from being chewed by pets, the old excuse for homework, or scribbled on by children? It might seem blindingly obvious, but you need to have confidence that your data are kept securely. And again, people. It sometimes gets forgotten that people might be stuck at home. Sometimes it might be nice to be at home, other times it might be a bit fraught, especially if you're trying to work from home and jump into home life as well. And you haven't got that contact, which Joanne alluded to. So it's giving people the confidence to know that they can work the hours they need to work to get the job done, fitting around their social activities at home. We're talking about not going out, but making sure that people are comfortable with what they're doing, and that at the end of the day, the job gets done to the best of people's ability. Okay, that's a quick gallop through GLP. I'm conscious of time. I think maybe if we move on to the GCP, and if you've got any questions, do them both for both disciplines at the end, if that's okay. Okay, so veterinary GCP. Next slide, please. Really, protocol compliance is going to be no different from the ICH GCP, except if you're working with animals, then quite often the procedures need to be done in close proximity. How do you do that? How do you maintain social distancing while trying to hold a pig in place while you do a procedure on it, for instance? Farm staff might need to be trained. Typically, the investigator will go out and do key observations, but if that's not possible, can you train the farmer or farm staff or the vet or vet nurse to do those procedures, to do those data recordings, those observations, etc. Biosecurity, one thing that we don't actually really know is whether COVID-19 is zoonotic. We do know it's zoonotic because it came from animals to man, but will it go to our test systems, to the animals that are on study? So we need to think about biosecurity, perhaps enhancing procedures. Can we get the PPE that people need to protect the animals as well as themselves? And obviously with supply chains being stretched just a little bit, that might be difficult. But you might need to cancel studies, delay studies. If you're doing companion animals, so pet studies, then you can just stop recruitment. Deal with the existing cases, but not move on. Excuse me. Some countries, vets who are looking after farm animals are considered to be key workers and can go out and do the work. Other countries, normal vet practice has been closed down. So it's very much country driven, country specific. So you have to see what's actually going on within your own environment in your own country. Animal welfare is important. It's a key component of the veterinary GCP that animal welfare is maintained. So having the right staff available to make the right decisions on animal welfare is important. And that will be the farmer, the investigator, the sponsor, the monitor, etc. Face-to-face visits might not be possible. There might be restrictions in place, illness. So can you do it remotely? Most people have a smartphone, so they can actually video what's going on, show pictures, cameras. Different ways you can overcome the problem to make a diagnosis, and particularly with AE reporting, adverse event reporting. A protocol might have just one or two options. You might need to amend the protocol to give multiple options for contacts within the investigator organisation, the monitor, backup monitors, sponsor, etc. So having the ability to make sure that the right people know about things that are going on is important. Excuse me. Okay, shipping, IVP, same as IMP, so it's investigation of veterinary product, it's already been covered. But probably the key thing is, will there be people there to actually receive specimens or IVP? The VMD, the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, put on their website that let them know if you're going to ship something to them, because there might not be anyone there to actually receive it. So it's making sure you can actually have people to perform procedures as appropriate. On veterinary studies, occasionally animals die, so can necropsies or autopsies be performed? Are there appropriate trained, qualified, experienced people available locally to do that? And again, it's thinking outside the box, using local vet practices, maybe a local vet who can actually come in and do that. So it's just thinking about what you need to do. Site visits. The monitor is required to visit the site before, during and after the study. But again, one might need to be creative with in-life visits and have remote monitoring. Data can be looked at by scans, or perhaps if you've got an electronic data capture system. But it might be using technology, so cameras, again, for the monitor to actually see what's going on. You can see what's being, the animal identification is. You can see what the IVP is being administered, the volumes, etc. The monitor might be ill, might be self-isolating, can't travel, so have you got backup monitors? And again, you might need to recruit contract monitors locally in country to do that for multinational studies. EDC, electronic data capture, is not the panacea to all ills, but it might need to be considered. If you're looking at long-term, thinking outside the box, can we shift from paper to EDC? That allows for remote auditing by monitor, QA, sponsor. So all those things need to be considered, either short-term and long-term, and perhaps allowing the monitors to work from home as far as possible. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Okay, study conduct is pretty much we've covered already. But one of the things you might need to do for veterinary clinical studies is use local labs for analysis, especially if you're looking for diagnostics for adverse events. But have you got sample storage stability? So if you've got study samples you're analysing for serology, if you're doing a vaccine study, or proof of absorption, if you're doing a pharmaceutical levels, etc., MICs, what's the stability? How can you actually delay the study, or is it going to be compromised? So that's something that only you can decide with the product you're working with. QA can work remotely in veterinary GCP. There's the expectation that the protocol is audited and the data audited and the final study report, so that can be done electronically. I quite often work now with copies of data being shipped, literally hard copy, or on a memory stick, or accessed electronically, so it's not beyond the wit of man to be able to do that for future studies. I guess GCP does not specifically require in-life audits. Many companies do, so if those aren't feasible, then it's going to be an amendment to the protocol, deviation to the SOP, etc. But again, it's risk-based. It's deciding what's the risk to study, how important is it, to make sure you actually cover what you need to do. And then lastly, submissions. At the end of the day, once the study's been finished, you're going to submit that the dossier to the regulator. That may well need to be delayed. So it's talking to your receiving authority to find out what's the impact. They're going to be stretched anyway, because most of those people are working from home. So it's having a discussion with the receiving authority. If you delay a study, if you cancel a study, what's the impact? Let them know, have that dialogue. Strategies might alter, because that's going to be impacting your product line, what people are going to be doing in the future. So it's not just today, it's downstream. If you're not doing the work today, it's going to have to be done. Something else is going to have to go by the wayside in the future. So it's just thinking outside the box and deciding how you're going to deal with it. And again, if you do have unavoidable, if you cannot physically monitor a study, what's the impact? And again, it's talking to receiving authorities. they could potentially reject a study if it has to be monitored. But if you've gone through all the hoops and tried to do things that you can do to actually be as compliant as possible, that's going to stand you in good stead. Okay, that's me done. Last slide. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Sven. Okay. I am conscious of time. I don't know, Michael, if you're going to say any questions have come up.
No, Sven, no question, but someone was pointing out that auditors can also use cameras as well as study directors, going back to the points you made in GLP. So they're just recognizing that other possibility for seeing but not being there.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Thank you, Michael. And that's something that the MHRA did put in their guidance. The remote technology is acceptable. You just need to make sure it does what you want it to do. So, thank you.
Thanks, Sven.
Brilliant, thank you. I am conscious of time, so thank you very much, firstly, the panel for putting together these slides. I know it's not easy, so a big thank you. Thank you to all of you who's dialed in, shared some really good questions and some suggestions. As we mentioned, I think we definitely want to continue the dialogue, so we strongly suggest that you continue discussions on the discussion forum on the RQA website. We're all in this together. We're all here to learn. So if you have any suggestions, any recommendations, please do share them on the forum. A few key take-home messages as well. As we said, watch out for what the regulators are saying. So, I mean, my favorite spot is literally growing. So try and read up on all the different regulations that are coming up almost on a weekly basis. And more importantly, and then someone mentioned again on the chat, is recognizing that at this point, a lot of our probably PIs are doing a more frontline job with the healthcare system. So recognizing that the sites are stressed, there's a lot of work, a lot of burden. So it's not necessarily what our priorities are also their priorities. So just recognizing that, and I'm sure it is being done, but just appreciating that there are a few reprioritizations that might need to take place. We've heard the common thread being risk management. We've heard about documentation, looking at things differently, doing some critical thinking and thinking of what is critical to quality, and really having to think outside the box, which a lot of us, be it large or small pharma companies, might not be used to. So we strongly encourage that we continue this dialogue. We're also looking at inspection readiness. So of course we're managing things now, but when we hit the recovery phase, looking back at things, what decisions were made, how were they documented, etc., etc. So I think it's important to look at it from not just the current, but also the future state. I want to really, again, thank everyone and thank RQA as well. We're hoping to come back with lessons learned or some more material maybe in a couple of months, depending on how things progress. But I just wanted to thank everybody for taking the time today to join the webinar. It's a great call. I don't know if you want to add anything before we close the session.
No, just to reiterate that the discussion forums are open. Please use them. Please go on our social media pages. Make sure that you comment on anything we leave in there. And take care out there. And I'll close the meeting now. Thanks everyone for their comments. We've had lots of people, more than I thought, on YouTube and here. So fantastic. And again, thanks to the panel. Fantastic collaboration. We'll really appreciate it. Have a good rest of the day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all and stay safe. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Bye.
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 Thank you.